Good morning. Once more, we want to have some discussion on research. Today, the focus of our discussion will be sampling. Sampling is an important aspect of research, which, if not properly done, may not yield good results. A study without appropriate sampling may not, at the end of the day, yield good results. And that is why it's an area that we must pay a lot of attention on. In our discussion, we want to understand the following. One, the meaning of sampling. Number two, why we undertake sampling. Number three, we want to look at sampling techniques. Number four, we want to look at some of the guidelines that we are required to observe when we are undertaking sampling. And then the last thing, we want to see how we can apply the sampling knowledge in actual research. I want to welcome you all to this discussion. And as usual, I want to urge anyone who finds some issues not properly articulated to note them down so that they can be raised at appropriate time for more discussion. Welcome to this important discussion. Let's start this discussion by understanding of what sampling is. Sampling can be understood as a process of selecting a small portion of the population and from which the opinion of certain issues that are of interest to the researcher are sought, so that it's not possible to carry out a research on the entire population. Say, a researcher is interested in understanding what citizens feel about the performance of government in a given area. It's not possible for a researcher to seek the opinion of all the 50 million citizens in Kenya. So instead, the researcher will look for or focus on a small portion of that population, and that fraction, its opinion or their opinion is generalized to mean that what they have said represents what others that were not directly engaged in the study could have said. So the process that leads us to arriving at a small proportion of the entire population is what we call sampling. That small group that we focus on and in which opinion about something is sought is called a sample. A sample, therefore, refers to a smaller, manageable portion of a larger group that the researcher focuses on and whose opinion is assumed to represent that of the entire population. Samples generally are used when population sizes are too large, and therefore it is not possible for a researcher to focus or collect data from the entire population. Thus, we use samples. The samples that researchers use must, in all respects, resemble the broader population so that the inferences or the conclusions that we make about a given research accurately represents the views of the entire population. Why do we do sampling research? So let's look at the justifications for sampling. One, sampling allows researchers to infer information about population based on the opinion or results of a subset of the population, and that is without having to undergo the laborious task of investigating every individual in that population. The other reason why we undertake sampling is that it reduces the number of individuals in a study, and this also leads to a significant reduction in the workload. So that if a researcher was to collect data, say, on 20,000 people, then a researcher may just need to undertake a study, say, on 5% of that population, so that the amount of time and resources required in reaching a smaller portion of the larger population is smaller, and again, the amount of time that we need to also reach the entire population, again, is quite high. Therefore, when we focus on a small portion, we're in a position to save time and also save resources. Sampling also permits generation of high-quality information by directing time and resources on a few cases. What this means is that if we dedicate sufficient time and sufficient resources on a smaller proportion of the larger population, we're more likely to go in depth and also to obtain quality information. So being able to go in depth and also generate a variety of information from few cases makes the study findings of greater quality, and therefore that will also help the researcher in answering the research questions more deeply and also comprehensively. Lastly, sampling allows researchers to derive conclusions that apply to the entire population by focusing on a small proportion of the population. For instance, if a patient was suspected to be suffering from malaria, then what the doctor directs is simply a small portion of the blood is taken and then tested to ascertain whether the patient suffers from malaria or not. It does not require the researcher to drain, or rather the doctor to drain the entire blood from the patient. So we undertake sampling because if we are able to get what we need in terms of providing answers to the objectives of the study from a smaller population, then there's no need of focusing on every member of the population. If the information we can get from few cases will still be the same as that which we are likely to get when the entire population is investigated. There are two broad types of sampling techniques, and these are probability and non-probability sampling. A sampling procedure that is called probability means that every member of the population has a chance of being selected to participate in the study. Whereas in non-probability sampling, individuals are selected based on non-random criteria, and this means that not every member in any given population has an equal chance of being selected. It means that some members have greater chances compared to others for being selected and therefore participating in the study. Probability sampling is mainly used in quantitative research, while non-probability sampling is largely used in qualitative research. What is meant by quantitative and qualitative research will be the subject of our discussion in another topic later. The diagram below is a summary of the various types of sampling. As I noted earlier, sampling methods or techniques can broadly be categorized into two: probability and non-probability sampling. Some of the sampling methods that fall under each of them are as follows. For instance, under probability sampling, we have simple random sampling, systematic sampling, cluster sampling, stratified sampling, multi-stage sampling. And under non-probability sampling, some of the examples of the types of non-probability samplings that we have are quarter sampling, convenience sampling, voluntary sampling, purposive sampling, and snowball sampling. The following discussion, we will look at each of them in a more detailed manner. Let's start by looking at some of the probability sampling methods. The first one that we want to look at is called simple random sampling. In a simple random sampling, the researcher includes the entire population in the sampling frame. For instance, if a researcher wants to select a simple random sample of, say, 100 students from a university named X with a population of 10,000 students, then this is what the researcher is required to do. First, the researcher assigns every student a number based on the university database from 1 to 10,000, and then use a random number generator to select 100 numbers. Alternatively, it can be done manually, although this can be very, very laborious. Another type of probability sampling that we want to look at is called systematic sampling. In systematic sampling, it is also called the nth sample, the nth name selection technique. That is, after the required sample size has been calculated, every nth number is selected from a list of population and then recorded. For instance, assume that a study has a population of n, and n is 100, and it intends to have a sample of, say, 20. The sampling fraction would be f is equal to, and f here is a fraction, is equal to 20 out of 100, which is 20%. And in this case, the interval, which we refer to as k, will be equal to capital N over small n, which is 5%, rather which is 5. Therefore, a researcher would be required to select an integer from 1 to 5. So that if you choose number 4 in your first category, then it means that every fourth number will be selected. For instance, you'll have to select number 4, you'll select number 9, select number 14, select number 19, until you reach your sample size of 20. This is what we call systematic sampling. First, you determine what your sample size is, and then you determine what the sample interval is. Then you decide which number in each interval do you want to pick. So that if you are to pick 2 and not 4, like in our case, then it means that in every interval stage, you will pick number 2, and you proceed systematically until you attain your sample size. Another type of probability sampling is called cluster sampling. Cluster sampling involves dividing the population into subgroups called clusters with similar characteristics. Assuming, for instance, that a researcher wants to collect data on criminal activities among the youth in Kenya, then the researcher may decide to divide the country into 8 subgroups based on the former provinces, which are Nyanza, Western, Nairobi, Rift Valley, Eastern, Northeastern, Central, and Coast, and with each province being considered a cluster. A researcher will then employ simple random sampling to select the clusters. For instance, out of 8 provinces, a researcher may decide to select 5 through simple random sampling. And the 5 perhaps may be Coast, Western, Nairobi, Eastern, and Central. That the selected clusters or the selected provinces are now the areas where the study will focus on. Simple random sampling will then be employed by the researcher to select study participants from each of the aforementioned clusters. Another type of probability sampling is called stratified random sampling method. This involves dividing the population into subgroups called strata. Strata are basically groups that consist of members that have similar characteristics. For instance, gender, same occupation, age category, among others. Then a researcher is required to calculate the sample size from each subgroup, and then which is based on the study population. For instance, take the case of a study on an organization that has 800 female and 200 male employees. Assuming that a researcher wants to select a sample based on gender, therefore gender becomes the basis of stratification. Now, to ensure that the sample reflects the gender balance in that organization, the population will be divided into 2 strata based on gender. That is 800 female and 200 males. A random sample will then be used to select sample from each strata, and a researcher must ensure that the sample reflects the numerical strength of each stratum, the population. In our case, therefore, it is expected of the researcher to have more females and less males in his or her sample, because females' number is numerically stronger compared to that of the males, so that the voices of female must be heard more and must reflect their numerical strength in that particular organization. Multi-stage sampling method is the last type of probability sampling that we want to look at. Multi-stage sampling is not a method per se, but it is called a method because it involves several methods used at the same time. For instance, a researcher might decide to use different types of sampling methods for the same study, or in selecting a sample from a population of one study, so that a researcher may use, say, a cluster sampling in the first stage, then followed by stratified random sampling, and then conclude the sampling process by, say, using simple random sampling. We use multi-stage sampling method if we want to enhance the representativeness in the study sample, so that there are studies that the use of one sampling method may disadvantage certain categories of individuals in the population, and as such, they may not be part and parcel of the participants that are, at the end of the day, engaged in the study. So to enhance representativeness and to ensure that each and every sectors of a population is given a chance to participate in the study, then sometimes researchers prefer to use multi-stage sampling method, so that at each stage of the sampling process, a method is used, and once used at that stage, the subsequent stage, a researcher employs other methods. Let's now turn our attention to non-probability sampling methods. The first one that we want to look at is called the quota sampling. In quota sampling, it simply entails the segmentation of a population into mutually exclusive subgroups. Then a researcher uses his or her judgment to select the subjects or units from each segment based on a specified proportion. For example, a researcher may decide to include at least a third of either gender in the study sample. It means, therefore, that a subgroup must be included and representation in the same capped at a given proportion. For instance, when we look at what the Kenyan Constitution talks about, that in every government appointment, there must be at least a third of either gender. That particular provision is based on quota sampling. Once that is done, then there's a possibility that each and every sector will have to be represented in that particular appointment. So that if we say that we want, say, take a study among students in a given university, and we insist that every group or every program of study will have a representation, then it means that we are using quota sampling method. And in the process, therefore, we'll ensure that every study program is included in the study and their views sought, and therefore their opinion will constitute part of the study findings. The other type of non-probability sampling is called convenience sampling. Convenience sampling refers to selection of a sample from individuals who happen to be most accessible to the researcher. It may be an easy and inexpensive way to gather initial data. However, it may raise questions about the representativeness of the population. For instance, if a researcher is interested in understanding the prevalence of drugs and substance abuse in a given university, then what a researcher does is to decide to collect data from the students that he or she happens to meet in the university streets or recreational centers. This means, therefore, that some of the students that are met may not actually be representative, because what the researcher does is the students that will constitute his or her sample are those that he happens to meet. Some of the students that the researcher happens to meet may not satisfy the criteria of being representative, and therefore offer responses that helps a researcher to obtain accurate and comprehensive data about a given subject and a study. The other type of non-probability sampling is called volunteer response sampling. A volunteer response sample is based on the case of access of the participants. Participants, in that case, volunteer themselves instead of the researcher choosing participants directly. Voluntary response samples are always at least somewhat biased, as some people will inherently be more likely to volunteer than others. This form of sampling is mainly used in medical studies, such as during vaccine trials. This is because some people fear that the trials they want to be put under can adversely affect them, and therefore there is no way a medical researcher or a scientist can coerce them to participate in the study. It is therefore the work of scientists or researchers to appeal to them, explain to them why it is important for them to participate in the study, explain to them the possible dangers that they're likely to face during the study, and therefore it is based on full information about what the study is that now persuades some of them to volunteer in the study. It is purely participation in the study purely on a voluntary basis. No participant is coerced to participate in the study. Like I've said, they are largely studies that are undertaken. Studies that take volunteer response sampling method are largely those that are made, those that are done in medical science studies. Purposive sampling method is also another type of rather non-probability sampling method. What is it? It entails the researcher using the expertise to select a sample that is most useful to the study. It is mainly used in qualitative research, where a researcher is interested in gaining in-depth knowledge about a given issue, so that the researcher is able to make statistical inferences at the end of the study. For instance, if a researcher wants to know more about the experiences of students, mothers, or accommodation arrangements in a given university, the researcher will purposefully select a number of student mothers with different accommodation arrangements in order to gather a varied range of data on their experiences. If, for instance, say the university wants to understand whether students are being taught or not, then one of the individuals that the university management might wish to interview or seek the opinion as to whether teaching is going on might be the class representative, might also be the chairman or the chairperson of the department. So they will be selected purposefully because, according to the university, they may have vital information about teaching, and in the process, they may provide accurate information about the status of whether or not students are being taught. So purposive sampling, we use it when we think that there are certain individuals within a given population that hold information that could be of greater value to the study than others, so that those whom the researcher believes have more information that can be useful in answering the study objectives, then the researcher can pick them directly without subjecting them to rigorous sampling process, because of the unique position they hold in a particular population, and which places them over and above others in terms of knowledge and experience, and also in terms of providing information that the researcher needs to answer his or her study objectives. The other type of non-probability sampling is called snowball sampling. Type of snowball sampling involves the selection of a study participant to look at through multi-stage sampling. Is not a method per se. The researcher first identifies a few participants involved that are several methods used at the same time. Is then used by the researcher to help the identification of other researchers. To use this process is repeated types of sampling methods
sample is
for the
achieved.
same study.
For instance,
or in selecting a sample
assuming a researcher
from a population of one study. So
undertake
that
a research
a researcher
on the
may use,
experiences
say, a
of
cluster
commercial sex
sampling
workers
in the
in a
first
given
stage,
area.
then
Since
followed by
there is no
stratified
record
random
or list
sampling,
of commercial
and then conclude the
sex
sampling
workers
process
in any given area,
by, say, using
the researcher will
simple
first identify
random
a
sampling.
few
We
of
use
them
stratified, rather
agree
multi-stage
to
sampling
participate
method
in the research.
if
The
we want
researcher
to
will then
enhance
request
the
the
representativeness
few that have
of
turned
the
up
study
to help
sample,
him or her
so that
in recruiting
there are studies
other commercial
that
sex workers
the use of
that they
one
know.
sampling
This
method
process
may
will
disadvantage
will
certain
proceed until
categories
the
of
desired
individuals
sample
in the
is
population,
achieved, or until
and as such
the
they may
process
not be
is
part and
completely
parcel
exhaustive
of the
and
participants
no more
that are at the end of the day engaged in the
subjects
study.
are being
So to
obtained.
enhance representativeness and to ensure
There are broader issues that as researchers we are meant to observe when deciding on which type of sampling method to employ in our study. Generally, probability sampling method is appropriate in studies where participants are readily available. So that if you want to take a study where participants are easy to access, easy to reach, and also they can easily participate in the study, then it is important that we employ probability sampling methods. Again, non-probability sampling is not appropriate where participants are hard to find. It's therefore possible to use it where it is difficult to access and to engage the population. In that case, it will require a researcher only to engage a few participants that are available and then use their responses for purposes of generalization. We must carefully take note of the kind of population that we want to engage and discuss and interrogate whether they are available easily or not easily available. If they're easily available, then we can use probability sampling methods. If they're scarce, either in terms of not being there or their identity is not clear, then we may need to employ non-probability sampling methods. As I also noted earlier at the introduction level, probability sampling methods, we also use them largely in quantitative studies, whereas in qualitative studies, we prefer more of non-probability sampling methods. However, there are studies in which the mixed method can be employed. That is, some issues can better be generated using probability sampling methods, while others are better generated using non-probability sampling methods, so that we may also have a mix of certain aspects of the same study where probability sampling methods are used, while in other aspects, non-probability sampling methods are used. This is what is required of us when we are using these sampling methods. First, identify the sampling method or methods that you consider are most appropriate for your study. Secondly, state the key tenets of the sampling methods that you have identified. Then thirdly, explain how each of the key tenets so identified fits the study population. Then, where more than one sampling method is used, explain how the sampling methods complement each other in the study. In other words, this is how you present your sampling method section. First, you identify the sampling method that you find as being most appropriate for your study. Then, the second thing you do, you state the key arguments, the key propositions of that sampling method. Then third,
explain how each of the key arguments that you have identified in that particular sampling method fits with your study. Then, if you have to use more than one sampling method, explain how the two complement each other. In other words, what is it that the first sampling method used cannot adequately explain that it is important to complement it by using another sampling method? That needs to come out clearly in your presentation of the sampling method section. I want to state that we have come to the end of our discussion on sampling method. It is a rich area and a very interesting one. So students are required to make observations and take note of issues that they think we need to spare more time to discuss in depth. Thank you so much for your time.